Chapter 2. They took her to the cemetery in a big old Cadillac. They took her to the cemetery, but they did not bring her back. An old song. I have taken the liberty, said Mr. Wednesday, washing his hands in the men's room of Jack's Crocodile Bar, of ordering for myself to be delivered at your table. We have much to discuss, after all. I don't think so, said Shadow. He dried his own hands on a paper towel and crumpled it, and dropped it into the bin. You need a job, said Wednesday. People don't hire ex-cons. You folk make them uncomfortable. I have a job waiting. A good job. Would that be the job at the mussel farm? Maybe, said Shadow. Nope, you don't. Robbie Burton's dead. Without him, the mussel farm's dead too. You're a liar. Of course, and a good one. The best you'll ever meet. But I'm afraid I'm not lying to you about this. He reached into his pocket and produced a newspaper, much folded, and handed it to Shadow. Page 7, he said. Come on back to the bar. You can read it at the table. Shadow pushed open the door back into the bar. The air was blue with smoke, and the Dixie cups were singing on the jukebox, Eco Eco. Shadow smiled, slightly, in recognition of the old children's song. The barman pointed to a table in the corner. There was a bowl of chili and a burger on one side of the table, a rare steak, and a bowl of fries laid in place across from it. Shadow took a seat at the table. He put the newspaper down. I got out of prison this morning, he said. This is my first meal as a free man. You won't object until after I've eaten to read your page 7? Not in the slightest. Shadow ate his hamburger. It was better than prison hamburgers. The chili was good, but he decided after a couple of mouthfuls, not the best in the state. Laura made a great chili. She used lean-cut meat, dark kidney beans, carrots cut small, a bottle or so of dark beer, and freshly sliced hot peppers. She would let the chili cook for a while, then add red wine, lemon juice, a pinch of fresh dill, and finally measure out and add her chili powders. On more than one occasion, Shadow had even tried to get her to show him how she made it. He would watch everything she did, from slicing the onions and dropping them into the olive oil at the bottom of the pan on. He even had written down the sequence of events, ingredient by ingredient, and he had once made Laura's chili for himself on a weekend when she had been out of town. It tasted okay. It was certainly edible, and he ate it, but it had not been Laura's chili. The news item on page 7 was the first account of his wife's death that Shadow had read. It felt strange, as if he were reading about someone in a story. How Laura Moon, whose age was given in the article as 27, and Robbie Burton, 39, were in Robbie's car on the interstate when they swerved into the path of a 32-wheeler, which sideswiped them as it tried to change lanes and avoid them. The truck brushed Robbie's car and sent it spinning off the side of the road, where the car hit a road sign hard and then stopped. Rescue crews were on the scene in minutes. They pulled Robbie and Laura from the wreckage. They were both dead by the time they arrived at the hospital. Shadow folded the paper up once more and slid it back across the table toward Wednesday, who was gorging himself on a steak so bloody and so blue it might have never been introduced to a kitchen flame. Here, take it back, said Shadow. Robbie had been driving. He must have been drunk, although the newspaper account said nothing about this. Shadow found himself imagining Laura's face when she realized that Robbie was too drunk to drive. The scenario unfolded in Shadow's mind, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Laura shouting at Robbie, shouting at him to pull off the road, then the thud of the car against the truck, and the steering wheel wrenching over. The car on the side of the road, broken glass glittering like ice and diamonds in the headlights, blood pooling in rubies on the road beside them. 2 bodies, dead or soon to die, being carried from the wreck, or laid neatly by the side of the road. Well, asked Mr. Wednesday. He had finished his steak, sliced and devoured into it like a starving man. Now he was munching the french fries, spearing them with his fork. You're right, said Shadow. I don't have a job. Shadow took a quarter from his pocket, tails up. He flicked it up in the air, knocking it against his finger as his left hand gave it a wobble that made it look as if he were turning it, caught it, slapped it down on the table with the back of his hand. Call, he said. Why? Asked Wednesday. I don't want to work for anyone with worse luck than me. Call. Heads, said Mr. Wednesday. Sorry, said Shadow, revealing the coin without even bothering to glance at it. It was tails. I rigged the toss. Rigged games are the easiest ones to beat, said Wednesday, wagging a square finger at Shadow. Take another look at the quarter. Shadow glanced down at it. The head was face up. I must have fumbled the toss, he said, puzzled. You do yourself a disservice, said Wednesday, and he grinned. I'm just a lucky, lucky guy. Then he looked up. Well, I never. Mad Sweeney! Will you have a drink with us? Southern Comfort and Coke, straight up, said a voice from behind Shadow. I'll go and talk to the barman, said Wednesday. He stood up and began to make his way toward the bar. Aren't you going to ask what I'm drinking? Called Shadow. I already know what you're drinking, said Wednesday. And then he was standing by the bar. Patsy Cline started to sing Walkin' After Midnight on the jukebox again. The man, who had ordered Southern Comfort and Coke, sat down beside Shadow. He had a short ginger-colored beard. He wore a denim jacket covered with bright sewn-on patches, and under the jacket was a stained white t-shirt. On the t-shirt was printed, If you can't eat it, drink it, smoke it, or snort it, then fuck it. He wore a baseball cap on which was printed, The only woman I have ever loved was another man's wife, my mother. He opened a pack of Lucky Strikes with a dirty fingernail, took out a cigarette, and offered one to Shadow. Shadow was about to take one, automatically. He did not smoke, but a cigarette makes good barter material. Then he realized he was no longer inside. You could buy cigarettes here whenever you wanted. He shook his head. You working for a man, then? Asked the bearded man. He was not sober, although he was not yet drunk. Looks that way, said Shadow. The bearded man lit his cigarette. I'm a leprechaun, he said. Shadow did not smile. Really? Shouldn't you be drinking Guinness? Stereotypes. You have to learn to think outside the box, said the bearded man. There's a lot more to Ireland than Guinness. You don't have an Irish accent. Been over here too fucking long. So you are originally from Ireland. I told you, I'm a leprechaun. We don't come from fucking Moscow. I guess not. Wednesday returned to the table, 3 drinks held easily in his paw-like hands. Southern Comfort and Coke for you, Mad Sweeney, my man, and the Jack Daniels for me. And this is for you, Shadow. What is it? Taste it. The drink was a tawny golden color. Shadow took a sip, tasting an odd blend of sour and sweet on his tongue. He could taste the alcohol underneath, and a strange blend of flavors. It reminded him a little of prison hooch, brewed in a garbage bag from rotten fruit and bread and sugar and water, but it was smoother, sweeter, infinitely sweeter. Okay, said Shadow. I tasted it. What was it? Mead, said Wednesday. Honey wine, the drink of heroes, the drink of the gods. Shadow took another tentative sip. Yes, he could taste the honey, he decided. That was one of the tastes. Tastes kind of like pickle juice, he said. Sweet pickle juice wine. Tastes like a drunken diabetic's piss, agreed Wednesday. I hate the stuff. Then why did you bring it for me? Asked Shadow reasonably. Wednesday stared at Shadow with his mismatched eyes. One of them, decided Shadow, was a glass eye, but he could not decide which one. I brought you mead to drink because it's traditional, and right now we need all the tradition we can get. It seals our bargain. We haven't made a bargain. Sure we have. You work for me, you protect me, you help me, you transport me from place to place, you investigate from time to time, and go places and ask questions for me. You run errands in an emergency, but only in an emergency. You hurt people who need to be hurt. In the unlikely event of my death, you will hold my vigil, and in return, I shall make sure that your needs are adequately taken care of. He's hustling you, said Mad Sweeney, rubbing his bristly finger beard. He's a hustler. Damn straight I'm a hustler, said Wednesday. That's why I need someone to look out for my best interests. The song on the jukebox ended, and for a moment the bar fell quiet. Every conversation had a lull. Someone once told me that you only get those everybody shuts up at once moments at 20 past or 20 to the hour, said Shadow. Sweeney pointed to the clock above the bar, held in the massive and indifferent jaws of a stuffed alligator head. The time was 11:20. There, said Shadow. Damned if I know why that happens. I know why, said Wednesday. You gonna share with the group? I may tell you one day, yes, or I may not. Drink your mead. Shadow knocked the rest of the mead back in one long gulp. It might be better over ice, he said. Or it might not, said Wednesday. It's terrible stuff. That it is, agreed Mad Sweeney. You'll excuse me for a moment, gentlemen, but I find myself in deep and urgent need of a lengthy piss. He stood up and walked away, an impossibly tall man. He had to be almost 7 feet tall, decided Shadow. A waitress wiped a cloth across the table and took their empty plates. She emptied Sweeney's ashtray and asked if they'd like to order any more drinks. Wednesday told her to bring the same for everyone, although this time, Shadow's mead was to be on the rocks. Anyway, said Wednesday, that's what I need of you, if you're working for me. Which, of course, you are. That's all you want, said Shadow. Would you like to know what I want? Nothing would make me happier. The waitress brought the drink. Shadow sipped his mead on the rocks. The ice didn't help. If anything, it sharpened the sourness and made the taste linger in his mouth after the mead was swallowed. However, Shadow consoled himself. It didn't taste particularly alcoholic. He was not ready to be drunk. Not yet. He took a deep breath. Okay, said Shadow. My life, which for 3 years has been a long way from being the greatest life there has ever been, just took a distinct and sudden turn for the worse. Now, there are a few things I want to do. I want to go to Laura's funeral. I want to say goodbye. After that, if you still need me, I want to start at $500 a week. The figure was a stab in the dark, a made-up number. Wednesday's eyes revealed nothing. If we're happy working together, in 6 months, you raise it to $1,000 a week. He paused. It was the longest speech he'd made in years. You say you may need people hurt. Well, I'll hurt people if they're trying to hurt you. But I don't hurt people for fun or for profit. I won't go back to prison. Once was enough. You won't have to, said Wednesday. No, said Shadow. I won't. He finished the last of his mead. He wondered, suddenly, somewhere in the back of his head, whether the mead was responsible for loosening his tongue. But the words were coming out of him like water spraying from a broken fire hydrant in summer, and he couldn't have stopped them even if he had tried. I don't like you, Mr. Wednesday, or whatever your real name may be. We are not friends. I don't know how you got off that plane without me seeing you, or how you trailed me here. But I'm impressed. You have class. And I'm at a loss right now. You should know that when we're done, I'll be gone, and if you piss me off, I'll be gone too. Until then, I'll work for you. Wednesday grinned. His smiles were strange things, Shadow decided. They contained no shred of humor, no happiness, no mirth. Wednesday looked like he had learned to smile from a manual. Very good, he said. Then we have a compact, and we are agreed. Oh, what the hell, said Shadow. Across the room, Mad Sweeney was feeding quarters into the jukebox. Wednesday spat in his hand and extended it. Shadow shrugged. He spat in his own palm. They clasped hands, and Wednesday began to squeeze. Shadow squeezed back. After a few seconds, his hand began to hurt. Wednesday held the grip for another half-minute. Then he let go. Good, he said. Very good. He smiled, a brief flash, and Shadow wondered if there had been real humor in that smile. Actual pleasure. So, one last glass of evil, vile fucking mead to seal our deal, and then we're done. It'll be a Southern Comfort and Coke for me, said Sweeney, lurching back from the jukebox. The jukebox began to play the Velvet Underground's Who Loves the Sun. Shadow thought about a strange song he found on the jukebox. It seemed very unlikely. Then, this whole evening had become increasingly unlikely. Shadow took the quarter he'd used for the coin toss from the table, enjoying the sensation of a freshly milled coin against his fingers, producing it in his right hand between forefinger and thumb. He appeared to take it into his left hand in one smooth movement, while casually finger-palming it. He closed his left hand on the imaginary quarter, then he took a second quarter in his right hand between his finger and thumb, as he pretended to drop the coin into his left hand. He then let the palm quarter fall into his right, striking the quarter he held there on the way. The clink confirmed the illusion, and both coins were in his left hand, while they were now both held safely in his right. Coin tricks, is it? Asked Sweeney, his chin raising, his scruffy beard bristling. Why, if it's coin tricks we're doing, then watch this. He took a glass from the table, a glass that had once held mead, and he tipped the ice cubes into the ashtray. Then he reached out and took a large coin, golden and shining, from the air. He dropped it into the glass. He took another gold coin from the air and tossed it into the glass, where it clinked against the first. He took a coin from the candle flame, from the candle on the wall, another from his beard, a third from Shadow's empty left hand, and dropped them one by one into the glass. Then he curled his fingers over the glass and blew hard. Several more golden coins dropped into the glass from his hand. He tipped the glass of sticky coins into his jacket pocket, then tapped the pocket to show, unmistakably, that it was empty. There, he said. That's a coin trick for you. Shadow, who had been watching closely throughout the impromptu performance, put his head on one side. We have to talk about that, he said. I need to know how you did it. I did it, said Sweeney with the air of one confiding a huge secret. With panache and style. That's how I did it. He laughed, rocking on his heels, his gappy teeth bared. Yes, said Shadow, that is how you did it. You've got to teach me. All the ways of doing the miser's dream I've read about. You'd be hiding the coins in the hand that holds the glass, and dropping them while you produce and vanish the coin in your right hand. Sounds like a hell of a lot of work to me, said Mad Sweeney. It's easier just to pick 'em out of the air. He picked up his half-finished Southern Comfort and Coke and looked at it and put it down on the table. Wednesday stared at them both as if he just discovered new and previously unimagined life forms. Then he said, Mead for you, Shadow. I'll just stick with Mr. Jack Damson for the freeloading Irishman. A bottle of beer, something dark for preference, said Sweeney. Freeloader, is it? He picked up what was left of his drink and raised it to Wednesday in a toast. May the storm pass over us and leave us hale and unharmed, he said, and knocked the drink back. A fine toast, said Wednesday. But it won't. Another mead was placed in front of Shadow. Do I have to drink this? He asked without enthusiasm. Yes, I'm afraid you do. Seals our deal. Third time's the charm, eh? Shit, said Shadow. He swallowed the mead in 2 large gulps. The pickled honey wine filled his mouth. There, said Mr. Wednesday. You're my man now. So, said Sweeney. So you want to know how the trick is done, huh? Yes, said Shadow. Were you loading them in your sleeve? They were never in my sleeve, said Sweeney. He chortled to himself, rocking and bouncing as if he were a lanky, bearded, drunken volcano, prepared to erupt with the delight of its own brilliance. It's the simplest trick in the world. I'll fight you for it. Shadow shook his head. I'll pass. Now there's a fine thing, said Sweeney to the room. Old Wednesday gets himself a bodyguard, and the feller's too scared to put up his fists even. I won't fight you, agreed Shadow. Sweeney swayed and sweated. He fiddled with the peak of his baseball cap. Then he pulled one of the coins out of the air and placed it on the table. Real gold, if you were wondering, said Sweeney. Win or lose, and you'll lose. It's yours, if you fight me. A big fellow like you, who'd have thought you'd be a fucking coward? He's already said he won't fight you, said Wednesday. Go away, Mad Sweeney, take your beer and leave us in peace. Sweeney took a step closer to Wednesday. Call me a freeloader, will you doomed old creature, you cold-blooded, heartless old tree-hanger? His face was turning a deep, angry red. Wednesday put out his hands, palms up Pacific. Foolishness, Sweeney. Watch where you put your words. Sweeney glared at him, then he said, with the gravity of the very drunk, You've hired a coward. What would he do if I hurt you, do you think? Wednesday turned to Shadow. I've had enough of this, he said. Deal with it. Shadow got to his feet and looked up into Mad Sweeney's face. How tall was the man? He wondered. You're bothering us, he said. You're drunk. I think you ought to leave now. A slow smile spread across Sweeney's face. There now, he said. Like a little yapping dog, it's finally ready to fight. Hey, everybody, he called to the room. There's going to be a lesson learned. Watch this. He swung a huge fist at Shadow's face, and Shadow jerked back. Sweeney's hand caught him beneath the right eye. He saw blotches of light and felt pain. And with that, the fight began. Sweeney fought without style, without science, with nothing but enthusiasm for the fight itself. Huge, barreling roundhouse blows missed as often as they connected. Shadow fought defensively, carefully, blocking Sweeney's blows or avoiding them. He became very aware of the audience surrounding them. Tables were pulled out of the way with protesting groans, making a space for the men to spar. Shadow was aware at all times of Wednesday's eyes upon him, Wednesday's humorless grin. It was a test, that was obvious. But what kind of test? In prison, Shadow learned there were 2 kinds of fights. Don't fuck with me fights, where you made it as showy and impressive as you could, and private fights, real fights, which were fast and hard and nasty, and it always were over in seconds. Hey, Sweeney, said Shadow, breathless. Why are we fighting? For the joy of it, said Sweeney, sober now, or at least no longer visibly drunk. For the sheer unholy fucking delight of it. Can't you feel the joy in your own veins rising up like the sap in springtime? His lip was bleeding. So was Shadow's knuckle. So how'd you do the coin production? Shadow asked. He swayed and twisted back and forth, took a blow on his shoulder intended for his face. To tell the truth, grunted Sweetie, I told you how I did it when we first spoke, but there's none so blind, good one, as those who will not listen. Shadow jabbed at Sweeney, forcing him back onto the table. Empty glasses and ashtrays clattered to the floor. Shadow could have finished him off then. The man was defenseless and in no position to be able to do anything, sprawled back as he was. Shadow glanced at Wednesday, who nodded. Shadow looked down at Mad Sweeney. Are we done? He asked. Mad Sweeney hesitated, then nodded. Shadow let go of him, took several steps backward. Sweeney, panting, pushed himself back up into a standing position. Not on your ass, he shouted. It ain't over till I say it is. Then he grinned and threw himself forward, swinging at Shadow. He stepped up into a fallen ice cube, and his grin turned to open-mouthed dismay as his feet went out from under him, and he fell backward. The back of his head hit the barroom with a definite thud. Shadow put his knee into Mad Sweeney's chest. For the second time. Are we done fighting? He asked. Maybe as well at that, said Sweeney, raising his head from the floor. For the joy's gone out of me now, like the pee from a small boy in a swimming pool on a hot day. And he spat the blood from his mouth and closed his eyes and began to snore, in deep, magnificent snores. Somebody clapped Shadow on the back. Wednesday put a bottle of beer in his hand. It tasted better than mead. Shadow woke up stretched out into the back of a sedan car. The morning sun was dazzling, and his head hurt. He sat up awkwardly, rubbing his eyes. Wednesday was driving. He was humming tunelessly as he drove. He had a paper cup of coffee in the holder, and they were heading along what looked to be an interstate highway, with the cruise control set to an even 65. The passenger seat was empty. How are you feeling this fine morning? Asked Mr. Wednesday without turning around. What happened to my car? Asked Shadow. It was a rental. Mad Sweeney took it back for you. It was part of the deal you two cut last night. Deal? After the fight. Fight? He put one hand up and rubbed his cheek, then he winced. Yes, there had been a fight. He remembered a tall man with a ginger beard and the cheering and whooping of an appreciative audience. Who won? You don't remember, eh? Wednesday chuckled. Not so you'd notice, said Shadow. Conversations from the night before began to jostle in and out of his head uncomfortably. You got any more of that coffee? The big man reached the passenger seat and passed back an unopened bottle of water. Here, you'll be dehydrated. This will help more than coffee, for the moment. We'll stop at the next gas station and get you some breakfast. You'll need to clean yourself up, too. You look like something the goat dragged in. Cat dragged in, said Shadow. Goat, said Wednesday. Huge, rank, stinking goat with big teeth. Shadow unscrewed the top of the water and drank. Something clinked heavily in his jacket pocket. Put his hand into the pocket and pulled out a coin the size of a $50. It was heavy and a deep yellow color. It was also slightly sticky. Shadow palmed it in his right hand, classic palm, then produced it from between his third and fourth fingers. He front palmed it, holding it in between his first and little finger so it was invisible from behind, then slipped his two middle fingers under it, pivoting it smoothly into a back palm. Finally, he dropped the coin back into his left hand, and he placed it back into his pocket. What the hell was I drinking last night? Asked Shadow. The events of the night were crowding around him now, without shape, without sense, but he knew they were there. Mr. Wednesday spotted an exit promising a gas station, and he gunned the engine. You don't remember? No. You were drinking mead. He grinned a huge grin. Mead? Yes. Shadow leaned in the seat and sucked down the water from the bottle and let the night wash over before him. Most of it he remembered. Some of it he didn't. In the gas station, Shadow bought a Clean You Up kit, which contained a razor, a packet of shaving cream, a comb, a disposable toothbrush packed with a tiny tube of toothpaste. Then he walked into the men's room and looked himself in the mirror. He had a bruise under one eye. When he prodded it experimentally with one finger, he found it hurt deeply, and a swollen lower lip. His hair was a tangle, and he looked as if he had spent the first half of last night fighting, and the rest of the night fast asleep, fully dressed in the back seat of a car. Tinny music played in the background. It took him a few moments to identify it as the Beatles' Fool on the Hill. Shadow washed his face with the restroom's liquid soap, then he slathered his face and shaved. He wet his hair and combed it back. He brushed his teeth. Then he washed the last traces of soap and the toothpaste from his face with lukewarm water. He stared back at the reflection, clean-shaven, but his eyes were still red and puffy. He looked older than he remembered. He wondered what Laura would say when she saw him. And then he remembered. Laura wouldn't say anything ever again. He saw his face in the mirror, tremble, but only for a moment. He went out. "I look like shit," said Shadow. "Of course you do," agreed Wednesday. Wednesday took an assortment of snack food up to the cash register and paid for that and their gas, changing his mind twice about whether he was doing it with plastic or with cash, to the irritation of the chewing gum young lady behind the till. Shadow watched as Wednesday became increasingly flustered and apologetic. He seemed very old suddenly. The girl gave him his cash back, and he put the purchase on the card, and then gave him the card receipt and took his cash, then returned the cash and took a different card. Wednesday was very obviously on the verge of tears, an old man made helpless by the implacable plastic march of the modern world. Shadow checked out the payphone, an out-of-order sign hung on it. They walked out of the worn gas station, and their breath steamed in the air. "You want me to drive?" said Shadow. "Hell no," said Wednesday. The freeway slipped past them, browning grass meadows on each side of them. The trees were leafless and dead. 2 blackbirds stared at them from a telegraph wire. "Hey, Wednesday." "What?" "The way I saw it in there, you never paid for the gas." "Oh?" "The way I saw it, she wound up paying you for the privilege of having you in her gas station. You think she figured it out yet?" "She never will." "So what are you? A 2-bit con artist?" Wednesday nodded. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I am, among other things." He swung into the left lane to pass a truck. The sky was a bleak and uniform gray. "It's going to snow," said Shadow. "Yes." "Sweeney, did he actually show me how he did that trick with the gold coins?" "Oh, yes." "I can't remember." "It'll come back. It was a long night." Several small snowflakes brushed the windshield, melting in seconds. "Your wife's body's on display at Wendell's funeral parlor in Present," said Wednesday. "Then after lunch, they'll take her from there to the graveyard for the interment." "How do you know?" "I called ahead while you were in the John. You know where Wendell's funeral parlor is?" Shadow nodded. The snowflakes whirled and dizzied in front of them. "This is our exit," said Shadow. The car stole off the interstate and past the cluster of motels to the north of Eagle Point. 3 years had passed, yes. The Super 8 motel had gone, torn down, and in its place was a Wendy's. There were more stoplights, unfamiliar storefronts. They drove downtown. Shadow asked Wednesday to slow down as they drove past the mussel farm. "Closed indefinitely," said the hand-lettered sign on the door. "Due to bereavement." Left on the main street, past a new tattoo parlor and the Armed Forces Recruitment Center, and then the Burger King, familiar and unchanged, Olson's Drug Store, and the last yellow brick facade of Wendell's funeral parlor. A neon sign in the front said House of Rest. Blank tombstones stood uncrusted and uncarved in the window beneath the sign. Wednesday pulled up in the parking lot. "Do you want me to come in?" he asked. "Not particularly." "Good." The grin flashed, without humor. "There's business I can be getting on with while you say your goodbyes. I'll get rooms for us at the Motel America. Meet me there when you're done." Shadow got out of the car and watched it pull away. Then he walked in. The dimly lit corridor smelled of flowers and furniture polish, with just the slightest tang of formaldehyde and rot beneath the surface. At the far end was the Chapel of Rest. Shadow realized he was palming the gold coin, moving it compulsively from a back palm to a front palm to a down's palm, over and over. The weight was reassuring in his hand. His wife's name was on a sheet of paper beside the door at the far end of the corridor. He walked into the Chapel of Rest. Shadow knew most of the people in the room. Laura's family, her workmates at the travel agency, several of her friends. They all recognized him. He could see it in their faces. There were no smiles, though. No hellos. At the end of the room was a small dais. On it, a cream-colored casket with several displays of flowers arranged around it. Scarlets and yellows and whites and deep, moody purples. He took a step forward. He could see Laura's body from where he was standing. He did not want to walk forward. He did not dare to walk away. A man in a dark suit, Shadow guessed he worked for the funeral home, said, "Sir, would you like to sign the condolence and remembrance book?" and pointed to a leather-bound book open on a small lectern. He wrote Shadow and the date in his presence handwriting. Then he wrote Puppy beside it, putting off walking toward the end of the room where the people were, and the casket, and the thing in the cream casket that was no longer Laura. A small woman walked in from the corridor and hesitated. Her hair was a coppery red, and her clothes were expensive and very black. Widow's weeds, thought Shadow, who knew her well. Audrey Burton, Robbie's wife. Audrey was holding a sprig of violets wrapped at the base with silver foil. It was the kind of thing a child would make in June, thought Shadow. But violets were out of season. Audrey looked directly at Shadow, and there was no recognition in her eyes. She walked across the room to Laura's casket. Shadow followed her. Laura lay with her eyes closed, an arm folded across her chest. She wore a conservative blue suit he did not recognize. Her long brown hair was out of her eyes. It was his Laura, and it was not. Her repose, he realized, was what was unnatural. Laura was always such a restless sleeper. Aubrey placed her sprig of summer violets on Laura's chest. Then she pursed her blackberry-colored lips, worked her mouth for a moment, and spat hard into Laura's face. The spit caught Laura on the cheek and began to drip toward her ear. Aubrey was already walking toward the door. Shadow hurried after her. "Audrey?" he said. This time she recognized him. He wondered if she was taking tranquilizers. Her voice was distant and detached. "Shadow, did you escape or did they let you out?" "They let me out yesterday. I'm a free man." "What the hell was that all about?" said Shadow. She stopped in the dark corridor. "The violets? They were always her favorite flower. When we were girls, we used to pick them together." "Not the violets." "Oh, that," she said, and wiped a speck of something invisible from the corner of her mouth. "Well, I thought it would have been, obvious." "Not to me, Audrey." "They didn't tell you." Her voice was calm, emotionless. "Your wife died with my husband's cock in your mouth, Shadow." She turned away, walked into the parking lot, and Shadow watched her leave. He went back to the funeral home. Somebody had already wiped away the spit. None of the people at the viewing were able to meet Shadow's eye. Those who came over and talked to him did so as little as they could, mumbled awkward commiserations, and fled. After lunch, Shadow ate at the Burger King. Then he went to the burial. Laura's cream-colored coffin was interred in the small, non-denominational cemetery on the edge of town, unfenced, a hilly woodland meadow filled with black granite and white marble headstones. He rode to the cemetery in the Wendell's hearse with Laura's mother. Mrs. McCabe seemed to feel Laura's death was Shadow's fault. "If you'd been here," she said, "this would never have happened. I don't know why she married you. I told her, time and time again, I told her. But they don't listen to their mothers, do they?" She stopped, looked more close at Shadow's face. "Have you been fighting?" "Yes," he said. "Barbarian," she said. Then she set her mouth, raised to her head so her chins quivered, and stared straight ahead of her. To Shadow's surprise, Audrey Burton was also at the funeral, standing toward the back. The short service ended, the casket was lowered into the ground, and people went away. Shadow didn't leave. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, shivering, staring at the hole in the ground. Above him was the sky. It was an iron gray, featureless, and flat as a mirror. It continued to snow, erratically, in ghost-like fumbling flakes. There was something he wanted to say to Laura, and he was prepared to wait until he knew what it was. The world slowly began to lose light and color. Shadow's feet were going numb, while his hands and face hurt from the cold. He borrowed his hands from his pockets, and for warmth, his fingers closed around the gold coin. He walked over to the grave. "This is for you," he said. Several shovels of earth had been emptied onto the casket, but the hole was far from full. He threw the gold coin into the grave with Laura, then he pushed more earth into the hole, to hide the coin from inquisitive gravediggers. He brushed the earth from his hands and said, "Good night, Laura." Then he said, "I'm sorry." He turned his face toward the lights of the town and began to walk back into Eagle Point. His motel was a good 2 miles away. After spending 3 years in prison, he was relishing the idea he could simply walk and walk forever if need be. He could keep walking north and wind up in Alaska, or head north, south to Mexico and beyond. He could walk to Patagonia, or Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. He tried to remember how it had got its name. He remembered reading as a boy of naked men crouched by fires to keep warm. A car drew up beside him. The window hummed down. "Want a lift, Shadow?" asked Audrey Burton. "No," he said. "Not from you." He continued to walk. Audrey drove beside him 3 miles an hour. Snowflakes danced in the beams of her headlights. "I thought she was my best friend," said Audrey. "We talk every day. When Robbie and I had a fight, she'd be the first one to know. We go down to Chi-Chi's for margaritas and talk about what scumpots men can be. All the time, she was fucking him right behind my back." "Please go away, Audrey." "I just want you to know I had a good reason for what I did." He said nothing. "Hey!" she shouted. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" Shadow turned. "Do you want me to tell you were right when you spit in Laura's face? Do you want me to say that it didn't hurt? or that what you told me made me hate her more than I miss her. It's not going to happen, Audrey. So, how was prison, Shadow? She asked him. It was fine. You would have felt right at home. She put her foot down the gas, then, making the engine roar, and drove on and away. With the headlights gone, the world was dark. Twilight faded into night. Shadow kept expecting the act of walking to warm him. It didn't happen. Back in prison, low-key Liesmith had once referred to the little prison cemetery out behind the infirmary as the Bone Orchard, an image had taken root in Shadow's mind. That night he dreamed of an orchard under the moonlight, of skeletal white trees, their branches ending in bony hands, their roots going deep into the graves. There was fruit that grew upon the trees in the Bone Orchard. In his dream, there was something very disturbing about the fruits, but on waking he could no longer remember what strange fruit grew on the trees, or why he found it so repellent. Cars passed him. Shadow wished that there had been a sidewalk. He tripped on something he could not see in the dark and sprawled into the ditch on the side of the road, his right hand sinking into several inches of cold mud. He climbed to his feet and wiped his hand on the leg of his pants. He stood there, awkwardly. He only had enough time to observe that there was someone beside him before something wet was forced over his nose and mouth, and he tasted harsh chemical fumes. This time the ditch was warm and comforting. Shadow's temples felt as if they'd been reattached to the rest of his skull with roofing nails, and his vision was blurred. His hands were bound behind his back with what he felt was some kind of straps. He was in a car, sitting on leather upholstery. For a moment, he wondered if there was something wrong with his depth perception. And then he understood that no, there really was someone that far away. There were people sitting beside him, but he could not turn to look at them. The fat young man at the other end of the stretch limo took a can of Diet Coke from the cocktail bar and popped it open. He wore a long black coat made of some kind of silky material. Then he appeared briefly out of his teens. A spattering of acne glistened on one cheek. He smiled and saw Shadow was awake. "Hello, Shadow," he said. "Don't fuck with me." "Okay," said Shadow. "I won't. Can you drop me off at the Motel America at the interstate?" "Hit him," said the young man to the person in Shadow's left. A punch was delivered to Shadow's solar plexus, knocking the breath from him, doubling him over. He straightened up, slowly. "I said, don't fuck with me. That was fucking with me. Keep your answers short and to the point, or I'll fucking kill you. Or maybe I won't kill you. Maybe I'll have the children break every bone in your fucking body. There's 206 of them, so don't fuck with me." "Got it," said Shadow. The ceiling lights of the limo changed color from violet to blue, then green to yellow. "You're working for Wednesday," said the young man. "Yeah," said Shadow. "What the fuck is he after? I mean, what's he doing here? He must have a plan. What's the game plan?" "I started working for Mr. Wednesday this morning," said Shadow. "I'm an errand boy, maybe a driver, if he ever lets me drive. We barely exchanged a dozen words." "You're saying you don't know?" "I'm saying I don't know." The boy stared at him. He swagged some Coke from the can, belched, and stared some more. "Would you tell me if you did know?" "Probably not," admitted Shadow. "As you say, I'm working for Mr. Wednesday." The boy opened his jacket and took out a silver cigarette case from an inside pocket. He opened it and offered a cigarette to Shadow. "Smoke?" Shadow thought about asking for his hands to be untied, but decided against it. "No, thank you," he said. The cigarette appeared to have been hand-rolled. When the boy lit it with a matte black Zippo lighter, the odor that filled the limo was not tobacco. It was not pot either, decided Shadow. It smelled a little like burning electrical parts. The boy inhaled deeply, held his breath. He let the smoke trickle from his mouth, pulled it back into his nostrils. Shadow suspected he'd practiced that in front of a mirror for a while before doing it in public. "If you've lied to me," said the boy, "I'll fucking kill you. You know that." "So you said." The boy took another long drag from his cigarette. The lights inside the limo transmuted from orange to red and back to purple. "You say you're staying at the Motel America." He tapped on the driver's window behind him. The glass lowered. "Hey, Motel America, up the interstate. We need to drop off our guest." The driver nodded, and the glass rose up again. The glinting fiber-optic lights inside the limo continued to change, cycling through their set of dim colors. It seemed to Shadow that the boy's eyes were glinting too, the green an antique computer monitor color. "You tell Wednesday this, man. You tell him he's history, he's forgotten, he's old, and he better accept it. Tell him we are the future, and we don't give a fuck about anyone or anyone like him. His time is over, yes?" You fucking tell him that, man. He's been co-signed to the dumpster of history while people like me ride our limos down the superhighway of tomorrow. I'll tell him, said Shadow. He was beginning to feel lightheaded. He hoped that he was not going to be sick. Tell him that we have fucking reprogrammed reality. Tell him that language is a virus and that religion is an operating system and that prayers are just so much fucking spam. Tell him that or I'll fucking kill you, said the young man mildly from the smoke. Got it, said Shadow. You can let me out here. I can walk for the rest of the way. The young man nodded. Good talking to you, he said. The smoke had mellowed him. You should know that if we do fucking kill you, then we'll just delete you. You got that? One click and you're overridden. Random ones and zeros. Undelete is not an option. He tapped on the window behind him. He's getting off here, he said. Then he turned back to Shadow, pointed to his cigarette. Synthetic toadskins, he said. You know they can synthesize bufotenin now? The car stopped. The person in Shadow's right got out and held the door open for him. Shadow climbed out awkwardly, his hands tied behind his back. He realized he had not yet got a clear look at either of the people who had been in the back seat with him. He did not know if they were men or women, old or young. Shadow's bonds were cut. The nylon strips fell to the tarmac. Shadow turned around. The inside of the car was now one writhing cloud of smoke in which two lights glinted, copper-colored in the beautiful eyes of a toad. It's all about the dominant fucking paradigm, Shadow. Nothing else is important, and hey, sorry to hear about you, old lady. The door closed and the stretch limo drove off quietly. Shadow was a couple of 100 yards away from his motel, and he walked there, breathing the cold air, past red and yellow and blue lights advertising every kind of fast food a man could imagine, as long as it was a hamburger. And he reached the Motel America without incident.